In 2003, a joint expedition of Australian and Indonesian archaeologists were sifting through 6 meters of wet, clumping clay. It was a grueling excavation. The soil conditions were so damp that the buried bones had the consistency of wet blotting paper, threatening to dissolve entirely at the touch of a trowel. They were digging inside Liang Bua, a massive limestone cathedral of a cave on the Indonesian island of Flores. Their mission was straightforward. They were tracking the migration routes of modern human ancestors traveling from mainland Asia down to Australia. Then, deep in the clay, a researcher struck a skull. It was labeled LB1. Based strictly on its small dimensions, the excavation team initially assumed they had unearthed the remains of a child. A close inspection of the jaw quickly dismantled that theory. The permanent teeth were fully erupted, and the molars showed heavy wear patterns from a long life of chewing tough food. This was a fully grown 30-year-old woman. And she stood exactly 3.5 feet tall. The dimensions defied basic anatomical expectations. The team was looking at a weather-beaten, mature adult, completely contained within a skeletal frame the size of a modern human toddler. Her bone structure was a biological mosaic. She possessed primitive wrist bones identical to a chimpanzee and a brain the size of a grapefruit. Yet she was found alongside finely knapped stone blades and charred bones that proved this population systematically controlled fire. When the findings were published, the scientific establishment pushed back. Prominent researchers argued this could not be a new species. They claimed LB1 was a modern Homo sapien who had suffered from a rare genetic disorder, like microcephaly, which physically restricts brain and body growth. Over the next 12 months, the excavation team kept digging. They pulled roughly 15 more incomplete skeletons from the exact same clay layer. Every single one shared the same tiny stature, flat feet, and primitive wrists, rendering the odds of a localized, identical genetic defect mathematically impossible. These bones belonged to a healthy, thriving, distinct species. To understand how a human being shrinks to the size of a 3-year-old, we have to examine the biological sandbox that forced them to adapt. Isolated landmasses follow a principle known as the island rule. In these environments, nature acts like a strict accountant. A finite island provides a severely limited supply of space and daily calories. For the small animals that wash ashore, this isolation is an opportunity. Without massive mainland predators like wolves or large cats around to eat them, a small rodent or bird can scale up over generations to fill empty ecological niches. On Flores, this unique dynamic produced literal monsters. The most dominant apex predator on the island was the Komodo dragon. This is the largest living lizard in the world, growing up to 10 feet long, packing 70 kilograms of muscle, and hunting with highly venomous serrated teeth. Above them, the canopy was patrolled by a giant 6'5" prehistoric relative of the marabou stork. Armed with a beak the size and shape of a literal spear, this massive bird was capable of plucking juvenile hominids right off the ground. Down in the dense brush, rats scurried across the limestone. But on Flores, these rodents measured over 0.5 meters in length. It was a hostile, closed ecosystem. To survive alongside giant venomous reptiles and massive carnivorous birds, an invading species had only 2 options: completely dominate the food chain or alter its own biology to fit the island's calorie constraints. For large animals, the island rule dictates the process of insular dwarfism. Massive bodies require thousands of calories a day just to survive. When food is scarce, the largest individuals are the first to starve, leaving only smaller individuals to reproduce and pass on their genetics. This metabolic math transformed the stegodon. This ancient, massive relative of the modern elephant washed ashore on Flores and shrank over thousands of generations until the adults were roughly the size of a cow or a donkey. When our early human ancestors arrived on Flores, likely clinging to natural rafts of uprooted trees after a tsunami, the island subjected them to this same biological pressure. To keep their metabolic lights on in a calorie-starved jungle, they shrank to 3 feet tall. Their bodies adapted to the rugged terrain. They developed flat, disproportionately long feet that forced them into a high-stepping gait to navigate dense routes. And while their brain volume dropped, their neural density remained high, preserving their intelligence. Reconstructions of the jaw and skull base suggest these individuals lacked the physical vocal tract needed for articulate speech. To coordinate a hunt, they likely relied on a system of whistles and bird-like chitters, sounds capable of signaling complex tactics to trap 800-pound stegodons without the need for vowels or consonants. This reduction in size was a highly successful survival mechanism. It allowed a human-like mind to survive in a habitat where a larger body would have quickly starved. Look at this data visualization mapping early human migration. Homo floresiensis were not ancient relics of a lost epoch. The fossils in Liang Bua Cave proved they were actively thriving on the island as recently as 50,000 years ago. That places them in our own historical neighborhood. While these tiny hunters were trapping elephants, our direct Homo sapien ancestors had already left Africa, painted the caves of Europe, and perfected complex hunting weaponry. Right at that 50,000-year mark, the Flores species abruptly vanishes from the fossil record. When researchers look at the soil layers, they find two primary suspects for the extinction. The first is geology. Flores sits directly on the volatile Pacific Ring of Fire. Soil samples reveal evidence of a massive eruption from Mount Kelimutu right at the time the bones disappear, an event that would have choked the vegetation and starved the island's food chain. The extinction was likely a 1-2 punch. A volcanic eruption severely weakened the ecosystem, and modern humans arrived on the shores of Flores shortly after, outcompeting the survivors for whatever limited resources remained. Today, the local Nage people of Central Flores maintain a highly specific oral tradition. They tell legends of the Ebu Gogo, a tribe of wild, 1-meter-tall forest dwellers with broad, flat noses and long arms, who relied on a strange, chittering whisper to communicate. The folklore describes a conflict that fractured when the Ebu Gogo began raiding village crops. In retaliation, the human villagers offered the creatures dry palm fiber as a peace gift. Once the creatures took the fiber deep into their cave, the villagers threw a burning torch inside, incinerating the inhabitants. The anatomical accuracy of these oral legends points toward a deep, mythologized cultural memory. These stories likely document the actual turf wars fought when the first modern humans reached the island and encountered the last survivors of a different lineage. This illustration has shaped our view of our own history. We are taught to see evolution as a neat, linear march from ancient apes straight to ourselves. But as this diagram shows, the reality is a messy, branching tree. Homo floresiensis was a successful evolutionary off-ramp, proving that hominids are animals subject to the same environmental laws as any other species. The remains in Liang Bua prove that our species is not a singular, inevitable outcome. We are one branch on a tree that was once crowded with different ways of being human.